When most people think of why the United States joined World War II, one answer usually comes to mind: the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941. That surprise assault killed over 2,400 Americans and prompted an immediate declaration of war on Japan. Days later, Germany and Italy declared war on the U.S., pulling America into both the Pacific and European theaters. But what if that's only part of the story? While Pearl Harbor was the trigger, it wasn't the real reason the U.S. joined the war. Behind the headlines and public speeches lay a deeper web of motivations: economic interests, ideological battles, geopolitical strategy, and a slow shift from isolationism to internationalism. In short, America's entry into World War II wasn't just about revenge, it was about reshaping the world. Isolationist on the surface, interventionist behind the scenes. In the 1930s, most Americans wanted nothing to do with another European war. After the bloodshed of World War I, the U.S. passed a series of neutrality acts to stay out of foreign conflicts. But President Franklin D. Roosevelt had a very different view. FDR believed that fascism and militarism posed a global threat to democracy and peace. Throughout the late 1930s, he quietly prepared the nation for a possible war. He increased defense spending, expanded the Navy, and supported rearmament, even as he publicly promised neutrality. Behind the scenes, America was already leaning toward the Allies. The Lend-Lease Act, passed in early 1941, allowed the U.S. to send billions of dollars worth of weapons, food, and supplies to Britain, China, and later the Soviet Union. Roosevelt called it, like lending your neighbor a garden hose to put out a fire. It was a clear sign: America had already chosen a side long before Pearl Harbor. Economic stakes, Depression recovery, and global markets. Another factor often overlooked is the economic motivation behind American involvement. The Great Depression had left deep scars on the U.S. economy. War production offered a way out, creating jobs, reviving factories, and stimulating growth. Even before joining the war, American factories were humming, producing tanks, planes, and weapons for Allied powers. Moreover, U.S. policymakers feared that if the Axis powers won, they would divide the world into closed economic blocs. That would lock America out of key markets in Europe, Asia, and Africa. For a capitalist superpower built on trade and open markets, this was unacceptable. So joining the war wasn't just about defense. It was also about preserving America's future as a global economic power. The Nazi threat, not just Europe's problem. While public opinion in the 1930s saw Nazi Germany as Europe's problem, FDR and his advisors believed otherwise. Hitler's ambitions extended far beyond Europe, and a victorious Third Reich could eventually pose a direct threat to the Western Hemisphere. American officials worried that if Britain fell, Nazi Germany would control all of Europe's industrial and military might. That could tip the balance of power globally, and challenge U.S. influence in the Atlantic and Latin America. Roosevelt even began secret naval patrols in the Atlantic and allowed U.S. ships to escort British convoys months before war was officially declared. The idea was clear: better to fight Germany now, alongside Britain and the USSR, than to face a stronger and more dangerous enemy later, possibly alone. Japan, oil, and the Pacific chessboard. As for Japan, the clash didn't start with Pearl Harbor, it started with oil. Japan had invaded China in 1937 and had ambitions to dominate Asia. To slow its expansion, the U.S. placed embargoes on oil, steel, and rubber, the lifeblood of Japan's war machine. In July 1941, the U.S. froze Japanese assets and cut off nearly 90% of its oil supply. Japan was faced with a dilemma: abandon its imperial ambitions or secure new oil supplies by force, mainly in Southeast Asia. But moving south risked a confrontation with the U.S. Navy. So Japan made a gamble: attack Pearl Harbor to knock the U.S. out of the Pacific long enough to grab what it needed. In other words, America didn't enter the war because it was attacked. It was attacked because it was already resisting Japan's expansion. Ideological war, democracy versus totalitarianism. Finally, the war was framed as a moral and ideological battle, and not without reason. By 1941, it was clear that the Axis powers represented aggression, racism, militarism, and dictatorship. Nazi Germany had already overrun most of Europe. Japan had committed mass atrocities in China. Italy was bombing civilians in Africa. Roosevelt often spoke of the four freedoms: freedom of speech, freedom of worship, freedom from want, and freedom from fear. These weren't just lofty ideals, they were a blueprint for a post-war world. The U.S. was preparing not just to defeat the Axis, but to lead a new international order based on democracy, human rights, and economic cooperation. Conclusion: more than just Pearl Harbor. Yes, Pearl Harbor was the moment that made war inevitable. But it wasn't the beginning of American involvement, it was the tipping point in a long, strategic process. The real reason America joined World War II was a blend of strategic calculation, economic interest, ideological conviction, and global vision. U.S. leaders saw the Axis not just as a military threat, but as a challenge to the very principles on which the nation was built, and to the future world America hoped to shape. So, next time someone tells you the U.S. joined the war just because of Pearl Harbor, you can say, that's not wrong, but it's not the whole story.